Mr. Strings, a short, scary story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. As he led me into the back of the store, the light from the outside world fading into a tangled forest of knickknacks and curios, I began to think that perhaps, finally, I had found the place, and that this, after all my searching, could be something special. I had been scouring the junk shops, antique dealers and curio shops of this particular city for over a month, sifting through the myriad and manifold collections of disparate delights, looking for that one treasure that would be the centerpiece of my exhibit. I had, it is true, discovered several interesting artifacts amongst the cornucopia of dross and useless things, but nothing that stood out to me as a genuine one-of-a-kind object of curiosity, such as would make visitors to the exhibit gasp or force the tiny hairs on the backs of their necks to stand on end. Now, finally, I hoped I may have found such an item. The exhibition, Creatures, Collections and Curios, had been booked for months. The idea was to arrange one room of the gallery into the appearance of an old curiosity shop, overlaying and storing a vast array of things from around the world and showing through these tangible, solid objects the power of narrative. My idea was for the visitor to be able to tour these objects and artifacts with a headset that would allow them to access information on each piece as they lifted it or pointed to it. In China, I had visited a row of antique shops that guidebooks advised visitors to frequent, not for the experience of buying anything, but because every single object stuffed onto the shelves or hiding in the nooks and crannies of the place had a story, a tale of its origins and providence that the owners would unravel for the curious visitor. On their own, the objects themselves were often worthless, or at least of extraordinarily little value. Once the story is linked to them, once the words were wound around them like golden threads of spider silk, their value rose exponentially. It was the story, not the solidity, that mattered, the woven and often invisible blanket of mist that shrouded the object and which would allow the owner to explain some detail about the piece. The experience for the visitor was to revel in the exploration of the histories that attached themselves to these objects. Therein lay the curiosity, and it was this experience I wanted to recreate. To that end, I had spent the past 2 years touring the world, visiting the markets, bazaars, and backstreet hovels where knowledgeable or inventive proprietors would regale me with the tales of their wares. Sometimes the plainest and least conspicuous of objects, a silver coin, a diary with every entry handwritten backward, or a tiny marble frog, would have the strangest and most outlandish tales attached to them. Like the black rose, beautifully carved from ebony and kept in a gorgeous velvet-lined box, that the owner assured me had once belonged to a vampire, and which he would not sell me for any price on account of how dangerous he considered it to be. Or the blackthorn stang or wand that the owner of a small curio shop in the north of England told me had belonged to old Demdike of the Pendle Witches, and which had been used to cast spells and bring harm to many over the years. Which was, in essence, and without such a tale of its origins, just a stick. On the other hand, some objects that appear to have potential, beautifully carved or strikingly grotesque, would turn out either to have no story attached at all, or some quickly fabricated nonsense that the owner had come up with on the spot. Many was the time that I had been enchanted by the gruesome tales of some figurine or hideously carved fetish doll and its many exploits, assured of its one-of-a-kind and unique nature, only to find dozens of the same figurines sitting in rows like soldiers on a stall in some tourist market not 200 yards away. Or turned over an aged-looking artifact that was alleged to have passed through the hands of Rasputin himself, only to find the words "Made in China" emblazoned on the bottom. The best finds were those for which some fragments of the story could be proven. When a verifiable link between the yarn and provable historical fact could be established. It was all well and good hearing that this medal had been worn by 5 generations of the same family in 5 different conflicts, and that its warped shape was due to it having stopped bullets on 2 occasions. But to then see photographs of the men wearing the medal, in photographs spanning decades if not centuries, made the find far more special. Then I would feel my heart leap a little at the discovery of something genuinely worthy of curiosity. And so it was, in a tiny but almost comically overcrowded junk shop, that I found myself following a wizened old man into a section of the shop I had not even known existed to look at a very special item. I had explained what I was looking for, that I valued items that had a backstory, that I was particularly interested in those items with a provable history, and that my wallet would most likely open if the piece had some sinister or supernatural link, and watched as the owner of the shop raised his eyebrows, hesitated for a moment, and then said he had just the thing. The shop itself was one of those junk shops in which the items seemed to loom inward, as if the corridors and passageways formed by the shelves were pathways in some dark forest, the trees on either side stretching their branches in grasping arches overhead, straining to feel the touch of another. In such places, the items seemed to lean toward one in such a way that if the passage is observed from a distance it looks almost like a tunnel, with rounded sides, the paintings, figures, ornaments and instruments curving inward to surround the visitor. At the end of one of these labyrinthine corridors was an immense painting that stretched almost from the floor to the ceiling, in front of which were stacked brasses and a variety of utensils used to stoke an old wooden fire. So large was this painting that it seemed to form the back wall of the shop, and I had assumed was either pressed up against it or nailed to it. It was then quite a surprise to watch the little man lift a curtain which had been draped over a hat stand to one side of the painting, and disappear by stepping into the darkness behind it, into an area I had not even realized was there. Following him cautiously, I came around the back of the painting and found a set of stone steps leading downwards, and which my companion, with the aid of a flashlight he had suddenly acquired from somewhere, was descending. Again, I followed. Cautious of wasting time listening to an old wives' tale, I again emphasized the need for the items to be linked to a verifiable story. The old man looked back at me as he cautiously placed his foot on each step and gave me a shallow smile. Then, in a phrase that seemed strangely anachronistic in this cavalcade of antique wonders, said, "If your friends have Google, they can check," before adding cryptically, "I tell you no lies. You see, he has scrapbook. Everything in there. Mr. String's bad, but he very real." 2 things in this sentence piqued my interest. Firstly, the reference to a scrapbook, which I hoped, as it seemed to promise, would collect together some historical details about the piece, beyond the hearsay and fanciful inventions of the junk shop's owner. Secondly, and more strikingly, the repeated references to the item Mr. Strings, not as an it, but as a he. Eventually, the proprietor led me to an ancient-looking chest of drawers, and told me to wait as he shuffled off into some other dark corner of this lower room and disappeared. For a few moments I simply stood, waiting, looking around the room. It was darker in here even than in the main shop, the entire place lit by the single bulb from a small Art Deco lamp in the corner. I waited for perhaps a minute, straining my ears to try to follow the old man's movements, back up the stone steps or across the floor of the main shop above. Instead, there was only silence. The atmosphere inside the room was warm and a little stuffy, as all seldom visited rooms are when entered, the air newly disturbed after months, perhaps years, of waiting statically, swilling slowly and lethargically around, conjuring up the ghosts of scents and aromas long forgotten. In the case of this room, it was a mix of old furniture polish, fur, and mould. a sickly sweet echo of an odour like that of flowers long rotted. It was the smell of age and decay. I leaned against the chest of drawers and yawned, a gesture that even then I realised was dramatically exaggerated, partially for my benefit. To break the silence, to underscore the fact that unlike everything else in this room, I was alive, living in the present and capable of movement. I shifted my feet, feeling the strange need to create sound, to keep moving lest I fall into a stupor and become just another static object in the room, waiting, frozen and forgotten, to collect dust. Again, I listened, wondering where in the hell the old man had gotten to when, beside me, something moved. It was a quick, wrenching jerk of a sound, as something pulled or dragged across a hard surface. I looked down at the chest of drawers and in particular at the third drawer, which had been fastened shut with a clasp lock and not one but two padlocks. The sound, I would swear if asked, seemed to come from somewhere within or behind that drawer. As if something within the drawer had moved of its own accord, the flat, hollow sound resonating through the sides of the wood and the thin bottom of the drawer itself. I bent slightly toward it. The chest of drawers itself was of marbled green colour and dating from around the turn of the last century. I stared at the drawer and more precisely at the locks, watching them closely for even the slightest whisper of movement. There was none. But then the sound again, a dull, almost cushioned thud from within as something shifted, and then, by the smallest increment of degrees, I watched as the bottom edge of the first brass lock shifted ever so slightly. I took a step back. Was it possible that there was something alive in there? Perhaps a rodent that had gnawed through the wood and become trapped inside, or some serpent kept in this cruel and unconventional manner that had been aroused and pressed against an edge. I began to feel slightly uncomfortable and realised that I was repeatedly glancing back toward the stairs and wishing that the old man would hurry up and return. Hurry up and join me, so that I would no longer be alone down here. I waited for a moment to see if the sound would come again, and realised that I was flinching at the thought, each second without the sound, stretching out like acres of time as I waited, like a dog that shrinks from an anticipated blow from a cruel owner, for the noise to come again. It didn't, and so I simply stood, alone in the near dark with my eyes flitting between the stairs and that third locked drawer, waiting, either for the old man's footsteps or another shift from somewhere within the drawers. Finally, there was a gravelly scrape of dust underfoot as the old man began to descend the stairs, the light from his torch dancing against the wall and casting strange elongated shadows as the ornaments and artifacts all seemed to jump toward the light, hoping to escape the paralysis of their prisons. Without a word, the old man tottered past me and towards the chest of drawers. In his hand, he held an ancient-looking key loop of the kind you would expect a jailer in some medieval dungeon to own. It consisted of an iron ring onto which dozens of keys of various shapes and sizes were affixed. With a jangling clatter of metal, the old man opened the first, modern lock, and with some difficulty managed to unclip the second, far older-looking lock as well. Before opening the drawer, he paused and looked me square in the eye, staring up from under his heavy brow and prodigious eyebrows with a resigned, almost melancholy look, as if trying to decide something. It was as if he were reading the lines on my face, trying to rearrange them into the characters of some forgotten script that would give him an insight into me and my motivations. It was an unnerving experience, made all the more unsettling by the man's obvious trepidation, underscored by the fact that as he removed the first padlock, his hands were visibly shaking. Finally, sliding the loop of the second padlock out from the clasp, he said, "You are okay down here, by yourself? Nothing strange?" He spat these questions in an abrupt rapid fire of words that turned them from being true questions into statements, reassurances for himself that helped to smooth over and flatten any cracks in his resolve. For a moment I became suspicious, wondering whether the sounds I had heard had been somehow prearranged, and that this entire scenario was set up either as a way of frightening me or increasing the dramatic effect of the sales pitch. Looking at his gaze, however, at the genuine searching in his eyes, and perhaps, I thought, behind it all, a genuine undercurrent of reluctance, even fear, I decided that this was not the case. I thought of mentioning the sounds, but decided against it, suspecting that it could be used as an excuse not to open the drawer, and instead sidestepped the question by beckoning him to continue. As I mentioned before, sometimes the nature of the object and the depth of its supposed backstory do not match. The most innocuous objects having the most horrific tales attached, whilst the most grotesque are simply ornamental or linked to only the least imaginative of second-rate ghost stories. With Mr. Strings, this was not the case. With him, the object and the story were perfectly matched, each as hideous as the other. Inside the drawer, lying on his back and staring directly upward, was Mr. Strings. He was resting, his hands limp by his sides in a small wooden case, the lid of which was clear glass so that he looked as if he were lying in a state like some deceased dictator awaiting a procession of faithful subjects. Mr. Strings, I should explain, was a puppet, but a puppet like none I had ever seen before. A marionette, he lived up to his name by having his appendages and joints attached to long lengths of wire or string. These cords ran through his hands, wrists, the points of his knees, feet, the elbows, neck, and head, so that in the hands of a skilled puppeteer he could be moved and articulated in such a way that his movements could mimic life. I say mimic because even the slightest glance would confirm that Mr. Strings was far from alive. The work and craftsmanship on the puppet itself were masterful, but in a strange contrast was a perfectly lifelike depiction of death. The entire body looked as if it had been shriveled, dried out over centuries, and withered down to its current size. At first I was drawn to the hands, to the tiny exquisite detail of each finger. I remembered the times when I had looked at my sister's newborn son and marvelled at the miniature perfection of his fingernails, and recoiled as my mind conjured the comparison between something so perfect and this hideous monstrosity. For worse, far worse than the hands, was the face. Mr. Strings' face was of a taut, leathery brown, the surface carving somehow polished and textured so that it appeared to be formed from a single piece of stretched shoe leather. Unlike most puppets on which the angle of the chisel makes straight or pointed lines that speak of having been fashioned by the hands of men, looked moulded, stretched, and warped, yet somehow rounded and organic. A gently sloping chin fell away beneath another curiosity, 2 rows of perfectly fashioned teeth, again minute in scale, but almost absurdly lifelike in their rendering. Whether fashioned from shells or ivory I could not tell at a glance, but beyond their shape it was the attention to the imperfections, the staining, textures and slight chips as of a real mouth that made their death's head grin, framed as it was by shriveled, peeled-back lips, all the more repulsive. Yet even this was not the peak of the thing's abhorrence. That honour was reserved for the eyes, which, resting below a sunken brow, seemed in their glassy stillness to have retained much of the life they reflected. The iris was the milky blue of autumn skies, the breadth of the white tinged around with red, making them seem to stare wildly outward with a crazed, maniacal glare, of the kind one sees on fish lying cold and lifeless on a bed of ice in a fishmonger's window. As I looked down into the drawer, the box, and at Mr. Strings, I could feel the old man's eyes upon me, watching me as I observed this strange prize, and as I traced my fingers along the wood of the box, the surface of the glass, smiled as I leaped backward, recoiling with the speed of a striking snake when I saw the eyes move. I am not ashamed to say that I screamed. Nor am I such a fool that I do not know that many hearing this will think me mad, mistaken, or simply a liar. All I can do then is assure you that I am none of these things and insist on every fibre of my being that I saw what I saw. Insist that as my hand travelled gently up the length of the glass, over the tiny, tattered suit in which Mr. Strings had been crudely dressed, I saw the fleshy orbs of his eyes roll, ever so slightly, to the right. Whether it was a trick of the light, some illusion created by shadow, or the way the old man moved his torchlight, I don't know, but the effect was undeniable, and to this day I am inclined to believe that it was no illusion. As I leaped backward, however, the old man simply watched, stoic and unmoved, his steady, unfaltering gaze holding within it a questioning denial. I, for my part, struggled to find words, to force the sounds to form and articulate, and instead simply pointed desperately into the third drawer coffin, my finger jabbing accusingly and repeatedly at the tiny figurine lying prone in the box. The old man shook his head. "Did not move," he said flatly. "Mr. Strings' puppet cannot move, cannot ever move." He made this proclamation in the same low, soft voice with which he had convinced me to go down there in the first place, and yet, in the finality of their conviction, they may as well have been carved in granite. The message was clear. Whatever I thought I saw, he did not want to know, nor was he willing to be convinced, even if I told him. With gentle, reverent care, as if lifting a baby from its crib, the old man leaned forward and dipped his hands into the drawer. For a moment, I thought of telling him to stop, of rushing forward and preventing him from committing a terrible mistake. Instead, I simply watched as he scooped and lifted from the drawer, not the box containing the puppet, but the large, hard-backed book that lay at his feet. Cradling the book in the nook of his arm, he gestured with his other arm for me to sit in an antique dining room chair that was pressed against one of the overstuffed shelves. I duly complied, my senses still swimming from the shock of what I had seen, what I thought I had seen. The old man handed me the book, and easing himself backward with an almost audible creak, lowered himself into a seat directly opposite me, intending to wait whilst I read the contents. Though this was a rather unsettling setup, I was glad of the old man's company. To my right, the chest of drawers still stood, the third drawer still open for Mr. Strings to stare blankly, lifelessly upward. Opening the heavy tome, I recognized immediately that this was the scrapbook of which the old man had spoken. A cursory flip through the pages showed it to be composed of various clippings from newspaper articles, receipts, advertisements, and the like, that at first glance seemed to be unrelated. Curiously, the scrapbook also seemed to work in reverse order, the most recent editions closer to the front, whilst the more yellowed and older entries were toward the back. The effect for the reader, therefore, was to travel back through the decades as they read. Not only was this a strange way to compose the book, but it also spoke, I thought, of some striking forethought on the part of whoever posted the first entry, beginning as they did with the anticipation that further entries, more stories relevant enough to be pasted in, would arise in the future. The first and most recent article was translated from a feature in a Chinese newspaper and recounted a tragic accident from a fighter kite show. Apparently, at such shows where professional kite makers race or display their creations and fight them with one another, it is common practice for the lines or strings of the kites to be lined with powdered glass to cut the strings of rivals. This makes what sounds like a genteel and innocuous pastime into a potentially dangerous activity, as contact with these taut, razor-sharp kite strings, pulled irretrievably by the force of strong winds, can have violent and tragic consequences. According to the article, numerous cases of people being seriously injured or even killed by such kites occur every year, and in the case recorded in this report, a young gentleman from Afghanistan, not participating in the show, had his throat cut by a glass-coated kite line. Gruesome as the story was, It was the opposing page, with its itemized receipt of items purchased by the unfortunate victim 1 month earlier, that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. Amongst the 6 items purchased from an antique dealer in Stone Town, Zanzibar, was an item listed as 19th century puppet, Mr. Strings. Below, a handwritten note explaining how the man, Mr. Afisan, had intended to display Mr. Strings in a puppetry museum, but did not get the chance. Again, I felt my eyes dragged from the page and over to the open drawer. The 2 heavy padlocks laid on the ground before it. From my vantage point, all that could be seen was the open drawer, and yet somehow, knowing that behind the worn green paint, that tiny form lay like the body of a child, made my skin crawl. I wished that the old man would close the drawer, reapply the padlocks, and keep him in there. Every time I shifted my eyes back to the pages, I felt other eyes, tiny, cold and blue, glaring out from the drawer toward me. I considered for a moment what I might do if, from the corner of my eye, I were to see Mr. Strings sit up, straight-backed, and watch the tiny head turn slowly towards me. I swallowed hard. The soft rustle as I turned the page, stiff with old newsprint and paste, sounding massive in the unbroken hush of the basement room. Around me, the assortment of junk and jewellery, cast-offs and curios, seemed again to lean in, huddling conspiratorially around me in a dark, closed circle, woven lace basketry of angles and shadows, shrinking ever inward and watching as I read. I shifted in my seat and felt the sudden urge to tug at my collar, to loosen its constrictive grip around my throat, and to get some air. I flipped through more stories. The story of another buyer, a young Californian man who had purchased the puppet intending to use Mr. Strings as a prop in an episode of a horror anthology movie, tying the gruesome history I was only now exploring to a new and fictional narrative in the hope of boosting interest in the production. I read the correspondence between the seller and this man, explaining how Mr. Strings would be perfect for his purposes. Then I read about his death. A separate article from 2 months later explained how the young man had been in a skydiving accident. Whilst his parachute had opened as planned, he had been blown severely off course and had come down in the middle of a lake. The parachute's nylon fabric folding over him as he entered the water, spreading across the surface and preventing him from coming up for air, trapping him below as the ropes and strings tangled around his limbs as he flailed and attempted to swim, to find the surface and the oxygen he needed. Instead, he drowned. Desperate now to find the beginning of this tale, to see the origin of these awful happenings, I skipped toward the back, my attention arrested by a drawing on yellowed paper of 6 men, members of an Armenian puppet theatre that had featured Mr. Strings as a character. The drawing was used to illustrate a story about a bizarre suicide pact in which all 6 men had hanged themselves at the same time from an iron chandelier in the central hall of the venue they were to play later that night. The drawing showed the chandelier and the 6 bodies hanging from the ends, each for their nooses creating what looked like a horrific mobile or ceiling decoration. Each of the 6 bodies dangling by a string. I looked over at the old man, whose eyes were fixed on me, quietly noting my reactions to each lurid story. Finally, I turned to the back page of the book. On one side was a handwritten letter, on the other a series of photographs. Taken together, these 2 pages made my blood run cold. The letter, dated the 22nd of December 1891, was written by a Mr. Jean Eclus, whom I would learn through later research was a renowned spice merchant. In it, he explained how 6 years earlier, Mr. Wilhelm Strenger had been responsible for the death of Eclus' brother. Mr. Strenger, it would seem, was the owner and proprietor of an establishment that provided a 2-penny hangover to the homeless and drunk of London's underclass. This implausible arrangement provided a long rope like a washing line, over which, for the price of 2 pennies, a drunk or destitute could hang as a way of sleeping, doubled and folded over the tight string, but held semi-upright by its length. They were not allowed to lie down on the floor, but for a few more pennies could pay for a bench at which they could lean over another rope. This appalling setup, which folk etymology would have us believe was the origin of the term hangover, was common in Victorian England and Ireland, and the particular establishment operated by Strenger was the last place visited by Eclu's brother, who, in the night, somehow managed to slip and get his neck caught in the rope, so that he ended up seated with the rope around his throat and was very slowly strangled to death. Whilst this could have been written off as an unfortunate accident, what followed was even more distasteful, as Strenger, with the help of his hired hands, stripped the body, sold the shoes, overcoat and cap to another patron, and finally pitched the body into the Thames River. It took Eclu 2 days of questioning and bribes to discover the fate of his less fortunate brother and the individual responsible. It took him 8 years to find someone who could help him to put his plan for vengeance into action. In October of 1890, on a ship returning from South America, was a man who had enlisted for the voyage, possessing the skills that Eclu required. In the letter, he speaks in a very matter-of-fact way of having personally followed and indeed hunted Strenger and unceremoniously slit his throat. Why he did not do this in the days, weeks, and early years after his brother's death owed to his plans for Mr. Strenger's mortal remains. The man, who arrived from South America, had first known about the practice of head shrinking, the ritual preservation of a vanquished enemy by pickling and shrinking the victim's head and retaining it as a trophy. I had seen examples of such shrunken heads in the Pitt Rivers Museum in Oxford, and several dubious examples in various places in the United States. Eclu's plans, however, differed somewhat from tradition. Whereas the usual process was to remove the skin of the face and scalp from the cranium, scrape away the fat and wrap the leather around a wooden ball, before the shrinkage took place, Eclu's desire was for the entire body, intact and complete, to be shrunk down to 1/8 of its size. Only when he was sure that his mysterious friend was able to help him in this task did Eclu exact revenge, and over the next 18 months undertook the various preparations, treatments and processes necessary to shrink the body down. Once this was achieved, the separate parts were severed from the joints and then attached to wires. All of which is to say that Mr. Strings was never carved. His lifelike detail was never the work of any artist. Wilhelm Strenger became Mr. Strings. On the opposing page was a photograph of the puppet's left foot. Unseen by me as a result of it being encased in a tiny leather shoe, the photograph showed how the foot appeared when exposed, the skin having been stripped away to demonstrate what lay beneath, a tiny, shrunken skeleton. I observed the minuscule structure of the foot, the minute bones of each toe, and the top of the foot. I felt my stomach flip and roll within me, and allowed my eyes to again fall on the open drawer, to trace the flaked green paint, the weathered ancient wood, and the black space above, and as I did, I felt my throat tighten. For halfway along the top of the drawer, perhaps 2 inches in length, glimmering with the oily sheen of tanned brown leather, 4 tiny and perfect fingers curled around the wood. I threw the book from me, scrabbling in a fit of panic, the chair clattering to the ground beneath me as I rose and sprinted toward the stairs, my feet feeling entirely detached from my legs, which seemed to have liquefied, freewheeling against the stone edges as I ran, grasped and fled up the stairs, through the shop and out into the street. A few days later, I shared my experience, unedited and as truthfully as I could, with one of the financial backers of the exhibit. Having discussed the matter with the other 3 backers, he expressed sympathy for my experience, but underlined the fact that I should make it my top priority to acquire the puppet for the exhibition, no matter the cost. At this point, I am sorry to say, my superstitions got the better of me, and despite my commitments, despite my years of collecting and the financial investment I had put into the show, I refused and withdrew myself from the project. I did not in any way want my name associated with the purchase of that doll. A few weeks later, I read that the curio shop where I had met Mr. Strings had closed. The owner hanged himself in the basement. The items in the shop were sold off by the family at auction, the catalogue for which I acquired, though there was no listing for a puppet or any item with the name Mr. Strings. When I contacted my former partners to inform them of this and to ask whether they knew anything about where the puppet may have ended up, they were reluctant to answer, repeating only that since our business relationship had come to an end at such an inconvenient juncture, it was not appropriate for them to discuss which items they may and may not have acquired or at what point in time. The exhibition is set to open in a fortnight. Having worked on its composition for so long, I am fully aware that in the third room, the main hall, there will be a large cast-iron chandelier hanging over the room. The chandelier has 4 solid branches and will hang around 15 feet above the floor. I am hopeful that it will be the only thing that will be strung up in that room, but I am, I admit, far from sure. This has been Mr. Strings, a short, scary story. Written by Stories from the Attic. Narrated by Robin McConnell. Copyright 2020 by Michael van der Voort. Production copyright by Michael van der Voort.